Welcome, everyone. So happy to be here together again and learn together again here at Drisha. Today's class is conversations on the Parashah. Each week we have different members from the Drisha's learning community, and this week we are welcoming Rabbi David Silber and Miss Noah Bat Miri.
Thank you so much. And just wanted to start by saying I think we're both very excited for this. It's kind of interesting because the material that we have in this double parsha is something I know Rabbi Silber has given very, very, very long classes on. And I've also given classes on related subjects. So trying to see what we manage to fit into 1 hour, and also encouraging your participation, folks who are here with us on Zoom, or if you're, chiming in from Facebook, because we do have a really interesting breadth and depth of knowledge in our community. So we have here the double parsha, Behar Bechukotai. Just to give a quick beat sheet of what comes up in this parsha, we get Shemitah, we get Yovel, we get some other laws pertaining to the observance of those two, and land use and debt laws, things of that sort that are also related. We get God telling us, if we keep the commandments, it'll go well for us in the land. That's always helpful to hear. And we also have some other things which I think are also still related to land in a way, like tithes on fruit and livestock, what we're actually producing on the land that we're using, and how that relates to our relationship with God. So that is the parsha that we're in. If you have your Chumash, you're welcome to peek in there for reference. We also have the link to Sefaria that Evie just shared for us in the chat. So if you would rather pull it up in another screen, you're welcome to do that. And Rabbi Silber, what do you think?
No, I think it's a parsha which is very, as you say, many different pieces to it. And the main focus is, remember, the first parsha, the main focus is Shemitah and Yovel. I would just add that this is the culminating parshiot of the book of Vayikra, and it actually in the Talmud is a signpost about reading the Torah in general. The Gemara discusses, again, there were two old customs about reading the Chumash, finishing the Torah either yearly or twice in 7 years, and the Talmud gives a couple of signposts about what you read when. And one of them, very remarkably, is that the Gemara says the blessings and the curses of the book of Vayikra are to be read before Shavua. Blessings and the curses is the second parsha, Bechukotai, and for whatever reason, don't want to get into it now, the assumption is that, or the rule, and it is that way, that we read that this parsha just before the holiday of Shavuot. Actually, it's typically 2 weeks before Shavuot, which itself is interesting. So apparently, it's not what you expect. The other signpost is reading the blessings and the curses of Devarim before Rosh Hashanah. That we sort of understand, it's the Day of Judgment, but why should we complete the or read this particular parasha before the holiday that celebrates rabbinically the receiving of the Torah? But what you do see is that somehow that however we understand it, that somehow it's understood that the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, which are tied in with the blessings and the curses, it's the only mitzvah that's mentioned in the curses of Vayikra, is non-observance of the Shemitah. So somehow the Shemitah and the Yovel play a very, very central role as understood by our tradition in terms of Torah in general. So I said it by way of introduction to think about what Shemitah and Yovel, some aspects of Shemitah and Yovel, I think is important in terms of understanding this practice that we have, and in terms of seeing how it relates to Matan Torah. That's enough for now. There's tons more to say over here, but we'll talk. We'll see where it takes us.
Right. So when we were talking prior to this talk about this talk, Shemitah and Yovel are related to each other in some ways that are very obvious. These are both calendrical observances. We have to keep track of them. And the Yovel year is related to the Shemitah cycle. You could not establish a Yovel year without having the Shemitah year established time and time and time and time and time and time again. but they also both relate to land use, which is one thing that always sticks out to me. That's my big interest, my big series of questions in the world, because we need land. It's very obvious to put it that way, but also as a people in the Chumash, we are becoming a landed people for what appears to be the first time. So we are getting rules, we're establishing rules for what we will look like as a landed society, as opposed to other landed societies that we dwelt with, we'll say, in different contexts throughout the earlier books of the Tanakh. And in particular, there's a question related to land tenure. I know a lot of people, myself included, like to look at like the ecological aspects of Shemitah and like, oh, is this, or, we being nice and friendly to the earth by, giving it a break. Although in the text, I do think it's saying that the land itself is observing the Sabbath. We're not imposing on it. We're not obstructing its Sabbath observance, which is a really interesting way to kind of put it. But in the more technical sense, we have questions related to land tenure. So who the land belongs to. And I'm wondering if you have any initial thoughts about, this idea of the ability for people or peoples to own land, and how God might have derived the particular laws that we're functioning under, what their purpose is, how they relate to other experiences that we've had as a people and proto-people, or questions that you have about these things.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, the first point you made, I just want to reinforce that the way the Torah describes both Shemitah and Yovel, it does put it in terms of the land. V'shavta haaretz Shabbat Lashem, the land should rest. The land observes the Shabbat. Shemitah is Shabbat haaretz, the Torah calls it the Shabbat of the land, which is interesting. And in terms of the Yovel, which is even more striking, it talks about, the land gets returned in the Yovel year. It says, V'chol eretz achuzatchem geula titnu la'aretz. In all the land of your possessions, you shall bring redemption to the land. It puts it in terms of actually redeeming the land. That's a very loaded phrase for us, to be goel the land, because our experience in the Chumash, the main experience for the people is being redeemed from Egypt. Right? God says, I'll redeem you from Egypt. And here we speak about redeeming the land. So there is something about the land as a kind of independent of people. It has its own independent identity, one might say. I just want to add one point about the significance of the Shemitah Yovel, which is that if you think about Shemitah, the Torah calls Shemitah, as you said, Shabbat of the land. But what's interesting is that if you think about how the Chumash begins, it talks about, first verse, God creates Shamayim and Aretz, right? Literally land, heaven and earth, heaven and land. But when you think about the way the Torah begins, the first creation narrative of the Torah is 6 days of creation, and God rests on the seventh day. So the seventh day is God blesses the seventh day, God sanctifies the seventh day. That's the first creation narrative. The second creation narrative is focused on this particular place within creation, which is Gan Eden, sacred space, special land. The place is very special. And that's the second creation story. And what's interesting about the Shemitah is, whereas in the Chumash, they're two discrete things. There's a sanctity of time and the sanctity of place or space. What's curious about the Shemitah is that on one hand, it's actually called the Shabbat, which is about time. On the other hand, it's Shabbat Haaretz. So here you have actually coming together in one practice, both of these elements of both time and space coming together, Shabbat of time and Shabbat of the space, of the land. So that's, I think, very striking. It really underscores how central this particular observance is. So I would just say, turn it back to you. I would say two things. First of all, the land seems to have its own identity. You bring redemption to the land the same way the Torah speaks about the Shabbat. You should rest on the Shabbat, but so should your family members, your servants, your animals. that Shabbat is a kind of universal day, God's day, and that everything should rest, not just the individual person. So I think that is important from that perspective. Then the other element is that in the Yovel year, the land is actually leaves my possession, so it was never fully mine to begin with. The land may not be sold in perpetuity. Lo timocher l'tzmitut, and there the commentaries are divided. What does that mean? Does it mean you shouldn't do it, or does it mean that you actually can't do it? But either way, especially if you can do it, what it's really saying is you may think it's yours, but you are strangers and sojourners with me. And I think something to think about is what are the implications of having that mindset, that it's not mine. I think it's something in general that's very important. And I think given a lot of what's going on, especially in Israel today, I think it's critically important to think very deeply about what it means to possess a land, or to think you possess a land. I think that's important, and maybe we'll come back to that, but I'll throw it back to you, Noah.
Right. So I remember you said at one point, it might have been in your Genesis class, it could have been in any of your classes, frankly, but you said it just pashut, like sanctity and ownership are mutually exclusive, just period. Like nice little fortune cookie sized ethic, but extremely deep and extremely important. And that, I think, is the complication inherent in this, because we do have this human idea, but it could just be a very aggrandized and historically established legal fiction that, you know, humans have the ability to own things. And we have this extreme ethic of practicing non-ownership of land, of the basis for life and civilization. Even the king is subject to soil. And to, you know, pull away from our sense of ownership, at least in theory. I know that we could also talk about how that is or isn't practiced in modern times, and that's another interesting question. And God's ownership of land, God's ownership of its produce. One thing that I found interesting rereading this was God actually gives us the right of usufruct during the Shemitah year. So usufruct is not such a common rights division in, you know, contemporary land use law, especially if you've been in more suburban and urban areas, because people's land is not producing fruit. But historically speaking, that was very much a thing. If you look in the Code of Hammurabi, there are a lot of categories of land that can't be sold, can't be given away, can't have their ownership transferred. Typically because there's some sort of obligation between the king who owns the land and the person who he's allowing to have tenure in that land. Maybe it's military service, maybe it's some other sort of favor. So you can't get rid of the land because there's an implication that you're trying to get rid of that obligation. So I have kind of an interesting, you know, question working in one corner of my mind. Do we have an obligation to the land that relates to the inability to ever fully alienate, you know, people from it? But God also is giving us the right to eat fruits from the land when it's not ours. So we can't work it, we can't treat it as our own possession, but if something comes up from it, you know, you can still eat, you know, a peach or a plum. Those probably are not the most stereotypically Israeli pieces of produce, but something grows up upon itself during the Shemitah year. You are allowed to eat it. That is one way that people are fed in the Shemitah year. But I guess that, yeah, that's a number of different questions there. And
Right, yeah.
go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to the first thing you mentioned, that I know exactly how I formulated it. I formulated it in many ways, but what I argued for in various settings, it's related to what you're saying, is that, I mean, the Torah here calls the land, the different terms for land, but the term that the Torah uses here in the Yovel is achuzatchem. Now, the term achuza literally means something you hold on to. The word achuza represents something that's actually yours. I mean, something that's in your hand that you hold on to. And the argument that I've made in the past, and it's a very broad argument. My argument was not just that my argument was on one hand that the degree to which you actually possess land is a degree to which you understand that you actually do not possess it. And I think that's a chuzatchem on one hand, and then the very Torah says in just a couple of verses later that you can't sell the land forever because it's mine. God says it pretty straight out. It's my land. You are strangers and sojourners with me. And the point that I have pushed for in many settings is that what it means is if you understand it's not actually yours, then to some extent it can be yours. But the moment you forget that, it's not going to be yours at all. And I would say that more broadly, I think that's true. And maybe I would say one of the basic ideas of the Chumash is that the human being is in fact not God. And that's something which is pretty basic in the first really Gan Eden story. Lest the human is banished from Eden because the human now may become or may think to become like God. Therefore, we are banished from Gan Eden. And on the other hand, we can establish some kind of covenantal connection to God, which is some measure of immortality, but only to the degree that we understand that we are not God. I mean, the Akedah is a perfect example of that because the Akedah is God saying to Abraham, whatever we may think of it today, but saying to Abraham, listen, life is actually mine. So if I demand it back, I have every right to do that. And if Abraham does sacrifice Isaac, he has no future. His only heir is actually Isaac at that point, covenantal heir. And he's willing to accept his own mortality, his own humanity in a very deep sense. And that's when he can establish some kind of covenant, some sense of an eternal covenant with God. So I think this idea that understanding what is yours and what's not yours, at the core that you are a human being with all the limitations, one has to accept that before one can enter into a real relationship with that which is divine and eternal. And I think it's true of the land as well. It's true on the level of relationships, it's true and connection to God. And I think it's true in terms of what the Torah says about the Yovel. You can't sell it because it's not yours. But understanding that in the land of your possession, you bring redemption to the land. So that internal, that internal movement back and forth, it is mine and not mine. And it's only is mine to the degree I recognize it's actually not mine. So that I think is, to me, it's sort of a basic idea that emerges from a plain reading of the Chumash. I would say just one other point to respond to what you said. In Sefer Devarim, it talks about someone walking through someone else's field. And it says that when you walk through someone else's field, you are permitted to eat of the fruit, but not to put it inside your basket. Now, what's interesting is that's the plain reading of the Chumash. I'm walking in your field, I'm passing through, and there are trees there. I can take fruits and eat them, but I can't take them in my bag and pack them away for later. Now, the Gemara actually rereads that. The Gemara assumes that that's not true. I mean, whatever they think the Pshat is, but what they claim is that's not actually the case. That the Chumash is not talking about somebody who walks through someone else's land. It's talking about someone who was working for somebody else. And they put it in terms of the rights of a worker. But the plain reading of the Chumash is not so. It's interesting that the rabbinic move against that, because that would really be saying something. I can walk into your field and just eat the fruit. I can't take a lot of it, but I'm hungry. I can take it. But the rabbis push back against that. But having said that, it is the pshat. So it is very interesting in thinking about to what extent, in other words, to what extent do we have ownership? That's really the question. And the Chumash seems to suggest that to a lot less of an extent than we actually believe. I mean, if you really had a Yovel, was it ever really practiced? I have no idea. But if you had it, means you can never actually buy the land is really never yours. You're actually leasing it. So I think that's very striking. Anyway, I just wanted to respond to that.
Right. I think a lot about that question of leaving the gate open, so to speak, because you're even not supposed to chase animals away. They have a right to eat from whatever. I mean, they might have different sensibilities about what they would like to eat, but I definitely know, growing up with fruit trees on the property, the cherries belong to the birds to the extent that the birds get them. That's just the facts of life. And for that to be acknowledged in the text, so to speak, I can't hoard, the cherries and, ascribe my purposes for them to be greater. And like, certainly like we can't impose commercial purposes on the fruits that are there. But that's kind of, that is the right of usufruct versus some sort of commercial exploitation rights. You can go in, you can get your carob. That's, a little bit more pertinent to the land of Israel. And, have a snack and that's great. Or maybe like, have enough to make a meal for your family, but not more than that. So I know that a number of commentators, think of it as like sort of like rehearsal for Eden. And some people think of Shabbat that way in general. But Shabbat for the land, and the idea that the land is observing Shabbat, the idea that the land has mitzvot of its own, so to speak, we see that it has a personality of its own. It will vomit if there are idol worshipers in it. It's just, it's gross. It can't handle that. And it makes me think,
also,
going back to this question,
it cries out. It cries out when blood is spilled, with
right.
Abel.
Right. So it has a personality, perhaps in the philosophical sense. I remember Dr. Sam Lavin's given a class like, is God a person? And people freaking out like, what do you mean? And we're not asking, is God a human? And I'm not, asserting that the land is a human, but the land is an individual of some sort that has individual rights and the ability to have a relationship with God separate from us. And in asking, how do we own things that we do not own? Perhaps we own responsibilities. Perhaps we own relationships with different things and entities, I'll say, not things, because this is true also of people. Thinking of this idea of sanctity, the land having sanctity, people having sanctity at different times and different, ways. I'm thinking about, the idea of traditional marriage. Like you say, I sanctify you to me, but then there's this marriage contract and people look at it and you're like, wait a minute, like, does he own her? He can't own her if she's sanctified to him. So what exactly, is at play in these complex relationships? And I was thinking also, one of the big things to me with Yovel is my second big question, is during Yovel, during the Jubilee year, you're supposed to free all the slaves. So people can be slaves. That was an economic reality around the world in all kinds of different societies. And the Torah says, like, for a while, but there's a day when it has to stop. So transferring, the family estate when you're in financial distress and you feel like you don't have any other options other than selling off your land, yes, you can do that, but after 50 years, it'll be to a certain extent as if that didn't happen. And the same with the utter distress of, being so poor that the only thing you have to sell is yourself. Yes, but after 50 years, that person, the land has to go back into the possession of the lineage that was given access to it. The person has to go back into the possession of God, because we're God's slaves first and foremost. And if, we are slaves in this world to other people, that's being, the slave of a slave rather than just directly to God. And I guess like a lot of I'd call it more sociological, but some of it obviously is historical research, looking into the question of why we have mechanisms for, obstructing the alienation of land, land tenure in particular. I know some people like kind of suggest that perhaps a large part of this, it isn't just about returning things to God. It's about, preventing a sort of monopoly, where you have one person who's doing really, really well for some reason or another, and that person just winds up with everyone's, house outside of whatever's owned by the temple. And if that person is wealthy enough to compete with or even overshadow the temple, what would that do for us as a religious society? So I'm wondering if God cares about the sociological or economic functions of these things, or or if it's just the straight facts that it all belongs to God. Does God care about the harm that people can do to each other in the 50 years between, Yovel to Yovel? Does God want to lessen that? Like, I know that there's, again, like a very strong interpretive line that the laws of slavery in Judaism are so robust to discourage slavery. And even in the Gemara, a lot of things that people will quote about different things, like, if you're, having really bad thoughts and you have to do a sin, like, first you should dress in all black, and then you should, find some place, go far, far, far away where there's nobody who knows you before you do it. It's to dissuade you from doing it. It's not giving you permission to do it. It's just making it an obstacle course to do it. So I know that's a very like broad and speculative question, but I'm wondering if perhaps there's something in different traditional sources or less traditional sources that comment on what this does to society.
Well, I think one can certainly make the argument that the Torah is very concerned about how people live together in society. You see that the end of the book about Midbar, which is really the end of the narrative of the Chumash, how the Chumash is setting up structures to allow people to live together. Let's start with the cities of refuge. And the cities of refuge, which the Torah places an enormous emphasis on, is there so people don't kill each other, basically. So we find a way somehow to live together, even with people we don't like. The cities of the Levium is another way. Well, all these things. The Levium were outcast. They involved in a civil war. They lived separately. And the Torah insists that the community is responsible for them, not just to feed them, but to give them spaces, give them places. I think that, I assume that the Torah is concerned about, yes, people living together, which is one of the main focus of the Chumash. Joseph and his brothers. I mean, there you have all the problems. You have Joseph and his brothers. Then you have a story where Joseph manipulates all the land into Paro's hand. The land belongs to Paro, all the money, all the cattle, all the land. And again, it may have been a necessary evil for Joseph to do that to save Egypt, but I think there's a critique there. So I think that's the case. I was thinking more about looking back. I mean, the Torah calls Shemitah Shabbat of the land, so it calls it Shabbat, and it's not an accident. I think that this is the mitzvah that the Torah singles out at the end of Vayikra, sort of to represent all of the mitzvot. God speaks to Moshe at Har Sinai, and Rashi says, why is Shemitah singled out as being a mitzvah from Sinai? Why Shemitah specifically? And the Ramban talks about that. But I was just wondering about looking back at Shabbat now and picking up what some of you said earlier, which I think is very important about Shabbat, that the land rests, the slaves rest, the family rests, and the idea that, let's remember that in the first chapter of the Torah, the human being and the animals are created on the same day. So there's something about recognizing the other as having some independent existence apart from me, whether it's the animals, whether it's the land, whether it's the other person. And I think that's incredibly important to take Shabbat seriously in that way. What it's really about is this for the human dimension to it. It's not just about imitating what God did. It's more about how one moves in the world. And we do move in the world with other people and with possessions, with objects and all that. And how one sees those objects. It's not all about me necessarily. It's about a recognition there are things that are actually not me. I think that's one of the critical elements of Shabbat. And I think it carries a lot of, one really takes that seriously. I think you walk in the world differently. And you recognize that the other has an independent existence. It's not mine, whether it's the land or whether it's, recognizing other people's rights or other people's way of thinking, etc. I would just add one thing in terms of slavery, because as you say, the Yovel frees the slaves. Now it is true in the Chumash, just for the, it's true that the Torah speaks about Hebrew slaves. That is true. It's not talking about the non-Jewish slaves. But personally, I sort of believe in what I agree with Yitzhak Greenberg on this one, that what the Torah has done is set certain things into motion. Because the given at the time was slavery, of course. It's pretty much a given in the United States of America. It was about 150 years ago. But anyway, the point is, it's a given. And what the Torah is saying is that it's slavery. Slavery is a bad thing. And you should know that because you suffered. And when you establish your own society, you eliminate, for your society, you essentially eliminate slavery, you move towards eliminating it. The rabbinic tradition then takes it beyond this, etc. So I do think that when one studies the Chumash, and whatever it may be, but over here with Shemitah and Yovel, I think it's pointing us in a certain direction. I think that's a very important point. And that, the slave is a person, and people, and freedom is the goal, because you can't be a full person if you're not free. And we have to make every attempt in our society to make sure everybody is free. And the basic mitzvah of tzedakah, actually, which was mentioned in Sefer, the main mitzvah of tzedakah in the Chumash to this point is what is known as pidyon shvuyim. Somebody was forced to sell oneself into slavery. What choice did they have? They have debts or whatever, but for whatever reason. And then it's incumbent upon the so-called redeemer, the goel it's called, right? To redeem the person. So you have that parallel between the goel who redeems the person and the goel who redeems the land. It uses the same word. So there's something about certain mindset, I think. And yes, it has, it plays out in terms of possessions of land, and it plays out in terms of relationships. But I think what's interesting is to think go backwards. That Shemitah is once every 7 years, but Shabbos is once a week, and then maybe to look back at Shabbat through the lens of Shemitah, and to think about what this day is actually about. Because I suspect that many of us don't think about this too often. It's more about the observing people. It's more about the nitty gritty, But the point is, beyond the nitty gritty, to think more broadly. What is this? What's it supposed to be teaching us, and how we walk in the world the other 6 days of the week? So I think that's something we can take from this parasha too.
I mean, that is interesting to think about, especially like if we're looking at, the land observing its own Sabbath. Like, I know what I think about, my Shabbat observance and what that does to the other 6 days of the week for me. I don't know that the land is thinking about the other 6 years of the Shemitah cycle. If it's saying, I want to be really productive the way that God is ascribing in these, texts. Like, if you observe the Shemitah, then you're going to be fine the rest of the time, because the year before the Shemitah you're going to get 3 years worth of harvest. Like, is the land saying like, yes, I want to be a real hustler, a real go-getter, and overproduce dramatically, so that people can store up and I can go on my vacation and rest for a full year and just laze about without being exploited for that full year. And that's a fascinating idea. And I wanted to bring it back to, again, like this comparatively bizarre ethic where we're saying that the land has, its own rights that are distinct from us in a way to the point that we will get kicked out if we do not respect the land's rights. And that is quite radical. And I feel like only a people who come from a nomadic background could really appreciate that, because everyone else relies on being on their land, claiming ownership of it, defending it. But, you can make an easy argument for non-human animal rights with a lot of people. The Torah makes an argument for the rights of trees, you can't cut them down just because you're at war with people and, they're in your way, whatever. Like, they have a right to be there too. They're just going to hang out and make their fruit. And then we have Orla. You can't eat from a tree before it's, grown up in the Torah's mind, and you've brought, its first offspring, its firstborn to Jerusalem. And I'm curious if there are other rights ascribed to the land that go beyond what we've talked about, other than this right not to be subjected to idol worshipers, and this right not to, have to eat the blood of murderers, perhaps, or murders, rather, blood of the murdered. Okay, that was grammatically difficult for me. And the right to observe its Sabbath, which might be coupled with perhaps a responsibility of sorts to hyperproduce in the year leading up to Shemitah. What other rights does the land have that pertain to the land rather than just our responsibilities and our relationship with it?
Good question. I mean, I must say personally that I do agree that the Chumash is pretty clear that you have to treat the land with a certain respect and bring redemption and, and allow it to rest and all that. Again, the land is used in that tradition in two different senses. One is geographically. We talk about the Holy Land, you mean the space, that, whether it's Jerusalem, whether it's the boundaries of Israel, whether it's a place where God communicates. Then there's also actually the land, the earth itself. The Talmud speaks about, the Mishnah speaks about the mitzvot tatula ba'aretz. They're referring to the actual land, Truma, Meiser, Orla, Bikurim, actually the earth itself. I think for a lot of us, we don't have that sense of the earth itself having some kind of sanctity necessarily. When you go to Israel, there are people who really have that sense. I think that's something about the land, the earth itself is very special. And maybe there are other peoples in the world who have that sense. Living in New York City or whatever, it's hard to develop that sense. So I don't know, it plays out in a lot of ways. By the way, I would say one thing about Shemitah, which is, I think, unique actually. Shemitah, of course, in our Parashah is Shemitah of the Shabbat Haaretz. It's the land itself. Then there's the Yovel, the Jubilee, which, we count 7 Shemitah, 7 times 7. Then you keep the Yovel also has the rules of Shemitah. So if it's the 50th year, you have 2 consecutive years where you're not working the land, which is, and then you have in the book of Devarim, Zed Dvar HaShemitah, and there it doesn't mention the land at all. And the Shemitah in the book of Devarim is about the cancellation of debts. If I loan you money and at the end of the 7th year, you can't pay me back, then on the books, the debt is actually canceled. And there's a whole discussion in the Talmud that what if you do want to pay back, and all these kinds of questions. But fundamentally, the point I want to make about the Shemitah of Devarim, the Shemitah Ksafim, and the Shemitah of our Parsha, Shabbat Haaretz, this is the only mitzvah I can think of, the only one, where both in the book of Vayikra and the book of Devarim, the Torah says, we know it's difficult to keep it, but it is possible to keep it. The idea of giving the produce for 3 years is a way to say, don't worry. Yeah, because we know it's because when Yovel comes, you have 2 years not working your land. So the Torah says, okay, that is true. We know it's very difficult, but sort of have the faith that it will work out at the end. And the same thing in Devarim. What do you mean? I lend the guy money. Remember, there's no interest in the Torah, so it's an interest-free loan. So I don't benefit from the loan in any way. And now the 5th year is coming, the 6th year is coming. I look at this guy; he has no money. How's he going to pay me back? So I'm going to say I'll never make this mistake again. I'm not going to lend money again because I just lose my money. The Torah says, don't think those thoughts. It's the only mitzvah we have, to the best of my knowledge, where the Torah is very aware of the difficulty of keeping the mitzvah. It's a very difficult mitzvah to keep, and there are many reasons not to. And it's actually very interesting in today, nowadays, for the most part, Shemitah is not really observed. I mean, we have the legal fiction of selling the land, etc. But most people in Israel are essentially, with a loophole, not observing Shemitah. So there's something about that idea of Shemitah being difficult, I think, which is, I mean, covenant in the Torah is difficult too. You're a slave and you're abused and whatever, but there's something about Shemitah in particular that both it's difficult, and as you said before, it's a matter of faith actually, that there's a demand there of sort of believing that it's going to work out for the best. Clearly, the Torah understands people's reservations about it, since it warns it in both books, two radically different things: the Shemitah of the lending money and Shemitah of the land. And in both cases, the Torah says, "Do not think those thoughts. Just lend the money. Just lend the money, and don't worry about not getting paid back. Don't say it's 50 year already. The guy's 2 years to pay back. He's not going to make it." So I think that's another, what makes this exceptional, among other things, is that the Torah actually deals with the mindset of the one who's observing it. And the Torah has a caution. So I'm just putting it out there, because nowadays, I mean, Shemitah is fundamentally, for the most part, not really observed by most Jews. It's observed technically. But if you rely upon the heter mechira, of Kook's heter mechira, you're not really observing it. Now, there are some people who do observe it in other ways, but on more of a global scale. And the reasons are given is it's a global economy. If you lose your market share for any extended period of time, you've lost the market share. You're not going to get it back. You can't say, "Oh, for this year, I'm not selling you any produce. No lemons this year." You know what I mean? It doesn't work. So, I mean, that's the question. I'm not being judgmental. I'm just saying this is the issue that comes up, but it's very curious. That's the issue the Torah herself raises, actually. So you just see to what degree apparently this is a very central commandment. So this is a central commandment. We know it's very difficult, but you should do it and not lose the faith. It's something about the Parashah that we don't have any other place, best of my knowledge.
I mean, that is a centrally fascinating thing to me for a lot of reasons, and trying to figure out the relationship between the land-related laws of Shemitah and Yovel, the debt-related laws of Shemitah and Yovel, the slavery-related laws of Shemitah and Yovel. It's easy to say, oh, of course it's all related, because if you look back in time at an agricultural economy, like that's all of it. Like, like what else is there? No one is mining Ethereum or, whatever people do for work these days. But it feels like this is a mechanism that, among the many things it does, it would prevent the establishment of an empire. And I know, again, when we were speaking about this before, I brought up that in one class Dr. Yael Ziegler gave, she pointed out, like, Egypt is based around a giant river, the Nile, and Babylon, Babel, whatever you want to call these different powers in Mesopotamia, also, big river people. And in Israel, there isn't a giant river, at least not yet. In the times of Yehezkel, there's supposed to be a river coming right up out of the temple. And that to me, like, again, like I think I said before, it feels like a very easy symbolic read that this material empire is not something that we're supposed to be chasing in land. Like, in being given a land, yes, we will have what other people have in the sense that we have a land, but we will not have an empire land. We will have a place to be with God land, as opposed to a place to subjugate other people, a place to, fiendishly exploit natural resources. That's not what the purpose of the land of Israel is. And I feel like if you're continuously obstructing the creation of massive land holdings that, you could look at the story in Egypt, or in American translation, you could think of, giant plantations. Dr. Aviva Ben-Ur, who is a historian of slavery, gave a 3-part class for Drisha, which is pretty mind-blowing. I think a lot of people were not totally ready for it. It's difficult to talk about slavery in a very real way, but there are societies with slaves and there are slave societies, and like Egypt that we came out of, that was a slave society. You get rid of the slaves, everything collapses. Some people would assert that, the modern economy is a global slave society of sorts, depending on how you're comfortable or not comfortable defining slaves, as opposed to a society where there are some people who are slaves. It's very unfortunate. but it's not the majority, and the economy is not on their backs. It's more of the, last case economic destitution that we're trying very hard to build a better, social safety net to make sure that people don't fall into that. And debts in general, I mean, the way that debt impacts the modern economy. But again, look at the story in Egypt. These people just didn't have anything else to give. Like, they could go into debt if that were a mechanism that were allowed to them, but it wasn't a mechanism allowed to them, at least not that I recall. It was just, you have to give us everything that you have. Debt is an alternative to everything that you have, but it puts a claim on your future. So it's taking someone's future from them. And I'm just wondering if I know that you've mentioned before that you don't feel like the Chumash is particularly against the idea of Israel having a king when we're in the land. Other people very strongly make that claim that it's begrudging. God doesn't want us to have a human king. But when we do have a king, he's not allowed to acquire too much wealth in the form of, precious metals. He can't have too many horses, and he can't have too many wives. He can't be like other kings,
Right.
And what he does have to do is he has to have a Torah scroll on him at all times and keep reading it,
Right.
So that's a very different vision for what a human king is. And again, it feels to me like some sort of negotiation with God. Like, when I give you this land, you get land like other people, but you don't get to use it the way other people do. When I give you this king, you get a king like other people's, but you don't get to use the king how other people's do. And I'm wondering if you think that read is just totally off and bizarre, or if it's not, if there are other, you get what other people have, but not the way that they have it type thing.
I agree with you. I certainly agree with you. In terms of the king, for sure. What the Torah says, you want a king, you can have a king, but one that I choose. I think the point I made about kingship, at least in my last book, was that God is very aware that kingship is problematic. The question is, it's what Churchill said about democracy. It may not be great, but it's better than anything else. The checks and balances and all that of something which is so needed. I did want to make a different point about the Parashah, though, I think, which is connected, of course, in terms of what you said. What strikes me about the first Parashah, about Behar, is this, that first it starts with Shemitah, then you get to Yovel. And then that's about half the Parashah. And then beginning in about the 25th verse, after the says, bring redemption to the land, then it says the following. If your brother means, doesn't mean you're literally your brother, but if your fellow Jew, let's say, was in trouble with straits and forced to sell the land, then the Redeemer has to redeem the land. Then he can redeem it himself if he can. If not, the closest relative redeems it, etc. Then if not, wait till the Yovel. And then it talks about selling a house. And then it talks about if someone had to sell himself as a slave, the responsibility to, once again, the relatives, the redeemer, etc. And then not to mistreat the slave, not to allow, if you know bad things are happening, you have to step in, etc. And what strikes me over here, and something that I think to think about, is this, that we all understand if someone's in trouble, you help them out, but there can be different ways to do a different mindset. In other words, nowadays, the term tikkun olam is a very popular term. Tikkun olam, let's make the world a better place. I'm all in favor of tikkun olam. But the Chumash is not talking about tikkun olam, actually. The Chumash is saying something else. Well, the Chumash is saying what is the grounding of the way you behave towards the other is not actually the other. The grounding is your connection to God. Once you understand that that's not, the land is not yours, it's God's land, and that God wants people to be free, okay, then we have to do God's work. And to me, there's a very big difference between tikkun olam on one hand and doing God's work on the other. They may both be good things, but if you have the attitude, if you understand I am God's servant, I'm going to do what God wants me to do, that I think has a very different feel to it. and it also will, at the end of the day, sort of incentivize someone or enable someone to do things that normally you wouldn't do. Just me and you, I'll help you out. But if you see it as this is what God wants, God put me on earth to do God's work. God gave me whatever God gave me under these conditions, then, okay, I'm going to do God's work, whatever it takes. God is a redeemer, I got to be a redeemer. God is Goel, I'm a Goel. And I think you have the net effect of that. First of all, simply on a practical level is very different. Because you just feel that's why you're put on earth. So, it's not, you don't have to thank me either, because that's why I'm here. So it's the way the Parashah is framed strikes me that it's actually framed in terms of that verse, bring redemption to the land that I gave you, okay? Bring redemption, and then you have all these rules. Tzedakah, Pidyon Shvuyim, etc. To me, it's Torah suggesting a very different way to see ourselves vis-a-vis the other person, vis-a-vis the world. And I think the effect of that is very different. I think the response of the person who feels that way, if we really see ourselves as this is my job, then you operate differently in the world. And I think that's what the Torah someway is suggesting here.
I think to me that kind of reinforces the idea I was toying with, questioning before, of if we can't actually own anything, then what is the ethical or possible mode of quasi ownership that we experience? And that would be through relationship obligations that we have with other entities. That would be through responsibilities. I know I mentioned before my big wow Shemitah experience in the United States when I accidentally got a pepper that was contraband, and trying to deal with that and learning to deal with that, and really internalizing the reality that it wasn't mine, it was never mine to begin with, and it was I only had usage rights to the extent that there was God's consent, and God did not consent for me to buy that pepper, to have that pepper, anything of that sort, which again, to someone who isn't religious, sounds ridiculous, and fairly so, but other societies are built on a different set of ethics. And if you're really starting from the assumption that literally everything is God's and God made it, and God either consents for you to use it in a particular way at particular times in particular circumstances, or God doesn't consent to your use of it at all, that really, I think that contextualizes perhaps all of religion, at least in terms of our physical practices. Kashrut doesn't have to be about, is this food healthful or not? It's just God doesn't consent for me to use that item that way, period. And again, that goes back to Eden. A lot goes back to Eden. Perhaps there was nothing, special about that fruit in particular. It's just we were not given permission to use it. And similarly, we have lots of instances of permission and lack thereof, both in contemporary practice and in the Torah. Why can't we touch Sinai until after the shofar sounds? Because God said not to do it. That's the crux of the reason. And I find that fascinating that we have this at such a micro level. Again, land is something that we feel in a secular mindset, what gives someone the right to land? Purchasing it, having the ability to defend it. In more ancient societies, that was pretty much it. You were there and you could keep other people off of it, keep them from doing things you didn't want done on that property. There you go. That's yours. And then that progressed to our more, formalized system where we have lots of paperwork. And if you have the deed, great. But this idea of just total non-ownership, but having that overlaid with responsibilities and relationships, I think it's.
I would say that I think there's I think within the Chumash itself, I think we can nuance it further. I think that even in this week's Parsha, in Shemitah, I think it's, and in Vayikra in general, I think that's what you said is what the Parsha is saying, which is, talks about, for example, let's say, Leket Shechla and Peyah, leaving the corners of your field. The term the Torah uses is tazov. It doesn't say give it to them. It says leave it to them. And that's very different. Leave it to them suggests I'm not giving them anything. It was never mine to start with. I have a field, but the edges of the field don't really belong to me. So when you're harvesting your crop, don't harvest the edges of the field. Something fell down, leave it. If you left it, whatever, you're harvesting a tree, there's stuff left there, leave it. Something dropped in your basket, leave it, etc. When you get to the book of Devarim, I think it's a little different over there, because there, the Torah does speak much more about you owning the land. It's your land, you're coming there. God is up in heaven someplace. Please look down on us from heaven. We visit 3 times a year. And I think there, once again, we are commanded to do it and to understand in some very deep sense that in reality, it's really not ours. But I think that, but even though it would appear at first glance that it is ours, because after all, we are working the fields and do the work. So there, I think there requires even more of a deeper imagination to understand that even though it appears to be ours, but actually it's only ours to the extent that we are conforming with using it whatever we have in the right way. And it strikes me that when it comes to, we have this at a very basic level, the idea of before we benefit from something, of making a blessing, a bracha. And what's very striking about the brachot, so we know the second brachot, each fruit has, if you smell something, you make a blessing, and the different kinds of fruits have different blessings. And there's a hierarchy of blessings. There's one blessing that's the highest blessing. So there are 2 highest blessings, and which means if you make a blessing on this food, you don't have to make other blessings. So you're sort of covered. The main blessing, of course, is bread. Motzi lechem min haaretz. It's called the Suda. You're sitting at a meal, you make a motzi, and you don't have to make a blessing in everything you eat. You can just eat it because it's all encompassed in that blessing. And the other one, when it comes to drink, is Bori Pri Gefen. And those are the 2 things actually that we actually create, right? The bread doesn't grow from the ground. I mean, the wheat grows, but it's a lot of work to make bread. It's not easy, So the idea is, and those are the highest blessings, because they involve the highest understanding of, you did a lot of work, you did an enormous amount of work. End of the day, though, without God's assistance, you have nothing. Without the rain, without the air, and without fertile land or whatever, you can work as hard as you want. So to come to that realization that even though I do the work, so I think it's mine, but in some ultimate sense, it's really God's. I think it requires more, and that's really that's one of the challenges we face. We work very hard, people working crazy hours to produce things, to make people make a lot of money. They think it's their money, that I did all the work. And yes, people do work hard, but to come to an understanding that in some very profound sense, we are strangers and sojourners. I think that's what the book of Devarim demands of us, even more than this parasha. This parasha is more obvious, but there it's not so obvious. So I think those are 2 different presentations. Bottom line is the same bottom line perhaps, but it's it's more tricky, I think, and say for even appointing a king. You can have a king. It might be a mitzvah, but you have to understand what that means and what the dangers are, and how we always have to be very cautious about what we are buying into and what the implications are. So I think that's what the Torah in general calls for. This week's parasha, I think, is a very striking parasha. And as I mentioned, just before we receive the Torah, we read this parasha, which is something to think about.
I think that is something to think about. I think that is definitely something to think about. If I don't own the place, I just work here. If we have all of these abilities to think that we own something, we probably don't want to get into the habit of thinking that we own the Torah, even when we become very, very proficient in it and have a great relationship with it. It's still a matter of responsibilities, more so than ownership, to the sense of being able to keep other people out, to weaponize it, to exploit it, to do harm. So I think that's very important ordering of things in the text. And we are at the hour now. I know that we could go on like this for more hours, but we won't, because we do have other classes this afternoon. But if other folks who were here wanted to chime in at all, don't be shy.
I had two comments. One is, well, from the very beginning, we're told La'avdal Shamra, that it's not that we own it. We have jobs and responsibilities here to do. Hashem put us here for a purpose. We're like the guardians of it. And Noah, when you were talking about the ground, I remember learning, I'm not sure exactly on this, but when they talk about the rules of marriage, it is learned from, it's compared to when Abraham bought Maras HaMachpelah.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's a comparison there between marriage and also acquiring land, because you had been talking about humans and land. So that's a very good connection to strengthen your point of that the land is in some sense compared to a person, that it calls out, that it has rights, that we can't just literally trample on it, that we have to respect it, that if we don't, and I think when you think of, all that's going on and all the pollution and everything, in a very physical sense, we have not been great guardians, and we are literally reaping the results of that. Thank you.
The pasuk in the Chumash, "V'salachta lavoneinu l'chatoteinu v'chaltanu." Take this as your nachala. Take this, right? Nachala was a piece of land, so you have your possession. So we speak of ourselves as being God's nachala. So that's,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Just wonderful, so broad, and the combination of the broad and then honing in on specific verses and expanding across literally centuries and centuries, right up until now, Debbie's last comment. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Silber and Ms. Miri, and thank you everyone who joined us today, not only here on Zoom, but also on Facebook. Just a few announcements that we look forward to seeing you again next week in this class on conversations on the Parashah. And next week we will be hearing from Rabbanit Adina Sternberg in conversation with Ms. Chaya Yuni. This will be on the Parashah starting the next book of the Torah, Bamidbar. And also just an almost final reminder that the virtual Summer Kollel application deadline has been extended to May 15th. So we just have about 4 more days. So you're in luck if you do want to apply for that. You can go on kollel.drisha.org, and just 4 more days. And I will see you next week. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Keep the ball.
Shabbat